Hello my dear friends, you're on the MilitarySummary channel, and in this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. Telling the truth, we had yesterday lots of very interesting updates, and we continue receiving different updates about yesterday events. So let's discuss them in details, and first let's continue with Rome. If you remember yesterday, the meeting between the President of the United States of America and the President of Ukraine happened, and later Zelensky made his own statements regarding that meeting. Good meeting, we discussed all one-on-one, hoping for results on everything we covered, protecting lives of our people, full and unconditional ceasefire, reliable and lasting peace that will prevent another war from breaking out. Very symbolic meeting that has potential to become historic if we achieve joint results. So that was stated by Zelensky after that meeting. Another important detail about that meeting is that, according to information we have, a funny situation happened yesterday in Rome at the Pope's funeral. Macron planned to join the conversation between Trump and Zelensky, for which 3 chairs were placed, but was rejected by the American president and the chair was removed. So as we can see, Donald Trump wanted to talk with Zelensky one-on-one, probably to give him updates he received from Putin during his special envoy meeting that took place a day before yesterday. But according to information we have, and I'll remind you that right after talks with Donald Trump, Zelensky had meeting with Macron, and most likely during that meeting Zelensky provided everything he got from President Trump, or maybe he hid some information. Anyway, this is very interesting detail. Another important thing is that the Vatican broke protocol to seat Zelensky next to Trump and Macron, reports the Telegraph. World leaders were being seated according to the alphabetical order of their countries' names in French. By the rules, Zelensky should have been somewhere in the 3rd row, but he was placed in the 1st row right next to Trump. So another important piece of news. Also, we received lots of very important updates from the territory of the Russian Federation, and the Russians the second or the third time confirmed that the DPRK forces were used in the Kursk direction. DPRK servicemen took part in the operation to liberate the Kursk region within the framework of the 4th article of the partnership agreement. You know that this is very important piece of news, because since the beginning of the special military operation, Zelensky has made significant number of attempts to ask, to force, to beg, I don't know, to force the European countries, anybody, to enter the territory of Ukraine and to help Ukrainians, let's say, to restore control over Ukraine of the borders of 1991. But yet nobody has confirmed its readiness, or nobody has sent forces to the territory of Ukraine officially. But we see that the Russians have completely different situation. They have, as we can see, strong ally who doesn't care and who doesn't afraid of to show their own face and to confirm that they were involved, or at least on the territory of the Russian Federation, fighting with the Ukrainian units. Now let's return back to Ukraine, to the ground. We have lots of very important details, and first let's talk about the Sumy direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. During the previous 12 hours we have some adjustments on map. Let's discuss them in details. The Ukrainian sources published this video from the settlement by the name of Loknya. In this video we can see how the Ukrainians of 36 Marine Brigade were FPV droning and attacking the Russian soldiers on the territory on the northern part of the settlement of Loknya. Lots of episodes that took place in the northern part, and now we see that the Russians most likely managed to restore control over the northern part of the settlement once again. I'll remind you that several days ago we adjusted this part of northern Loknya in Ukrainian favor, because we had proofs that the Russians were attacking this territory. For example, this video was published on the 23rd of April, and here we can see how the Russians were attacking the most northern part of the settlement with drones. So which means that by the beginning of the 23rd of April, this part of the settlement was under complete Ukrainian control. But today, by the beginning of the 27th of April, we see that this part of village was retaken by the Russians once again. So this is very important battle, because this is, despite the fact that this is the battle for the settlement of Loknya, basically this is the beginning of the battle for the northern outskirts of the settlement of Yunakivka, because Loknya and Yunakivka, it's like one village, one big village. Furthermore, according to several reliable pro-Russian resources, the Guards paratroopers from the 51st Guards Airborne Assault Regiment continued their offensive west of Oleshnya and advanced into the Sumy region, clearing the first Ukrainian armored forces defense line at the state border in a 3-belt. So, according to pro-Russian resources, during the previous day, they managed to move further from the settlement of Oleshnya to take under control a small forest by the name of Dubina, this one territory. So let's compare the map between the dates. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 26th of April, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 27th of April. We see that the Russians are getting closer and closer to the settlement of Yunakivka, because the settlement of Yunakivka is obviously a part of Russian secure zone that they're planning to establish probably before offensive operation further in the direction of Sumy. Now let's talk about the city of Sudzha, and basically let's talk about the Kursk offensive operation or liberating operation carried out by the Russians, because today we got additional details. According to Russians, since March, 808 people have been evacuated from the liberated territories of the Kursk region, according to governor of the Kursk region. Another important statement that Russia is investigating reports of hundreds of civilians killed in the Sudzha district of Russia's Kursk region during the Ukrainian occupation. That was told also by the Russian authorities. Another important thing that Ukraine still holds 52 residents of Kursk region. This violates international norms. So we see that we're going to receive more and more updates for Sudzha region during the next several months. Now let's move to the settlement of Gornal, which was retaken by the Russians by the 26th of April of 2025, and today we got additional changes on the map. According to several mappers, according to pro-Ukrainian resources and according to neutral resources, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to take under control this small part. As once again, this is the situation by the end of the 26th of April, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 27th of April. We see that the Russians are getting closer and closer to the border with Ukraine, and then with the purpose to enter the territory of Ukraine itself. I'll remind you that since yesterday, the group of forces Kursk is responsible for offensive operation deep inside of the territory of Sumy. Now let's talk about the Belgorod direction. The Russians, according to different sources, indeed managed to restore control over the settlement of Popovka and to secure some tree lines and some positions around the settlement. At the same time, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine along the border and on the territory of Sumy region. Possibly the Russians are trying to destroy the temporary deployment points of the armored forces of Ukraine and those territories that the Russians are planning to attack during the first wave of attack and first attempt. So the Russians, as you can see, fapped Ukrainian positions in this point, and the Russians fapped Ukrainian positions in this forest. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation around the city of Kharkiv. The Ukrainians, according to information we have, expect that the Russians are planning to resume their attempts to attack the city of Kharkiv, and according to different sources, the Ukrainians continue improving their positions and defense belt around the city of Kharkiv. According to different data, the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions of the city of Kharkiv from the east and from the northwest. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. During the previous 24 hours, during the previous night, we got lots of very important details. And first, let's talk about the city of Chasiv. Several pro-Russian mappers reported that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to almost establish complete control over the central part of the city of Chasiv, and the battle for the final micro-districts have begun. The Russians answered this micro-district of Shevchenka and the micro-district of Tsech number 2. The central part was almost cleared by the Russians, according to pro-Russian resources. So we expect that due to this configuration of map, we expect that the central part of the city of Chasiv would be abandoned by the Ukrainians during the next 24 hours. The Russians with this will be able to maintain and to shorten the lines, and the battle for the final part of the city of Chasiv will begin. Another important thing that we see that there are still lots of days before the 9th of May, so we expect that the Russians will try to establish complete control over the city of Chasiv before this date. Obviously, this will be a huge media victory for the Russians if they are able to take under complete control more than 90% and to establish flags and to announce a huge victory. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the pockets along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbas canal. Several mappers today reported that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian first defense belt in this area and to establish complete control over significant territories and shortening the distance to the villages of the north in Velyka. So once again, this is the situation by the end of the 26th of April, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 27th of April. The village of the south in Velyka is about to be taken by the Russians completely, and the Russians are about to enter this dense network of the fortifications. As for the Kliban-Bykskaya direction, there are very heavy clashes for the southern part of the settlement of Stara Nikolaevka. Probably the fourth or even the fifth day in a row we are receiving another update that the Russians are entering the southern part of the settlement of Stara Nikolaevka, but we still see that the Russians haven't managed to dig in deeper and to take some at least small foothold in this part of the settlement. We expect that this will happen during the next several days, but as for now, the Ukrainians show fierce resistance. At the same time, the Russians continue advancing or began advancing in the direction of the settlement by the name of Alexandropol. This information was confirmed by different mappers. They shown us that the Russians improved their positions in the fields between the settlements of Tarasovka and Alexandropol itself. So these are the changes on the ground according to different sources. At the same time, according to neutral mappers, the Ukrainians carry out several successful counterattacks in the northern part of the settlement of Tarasovka, and the Ukrainians managed to restore control over at least the northern part of the settlement, as for now without any proofs that can confirm this. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. There are still very heavy clashes for the eastern flank of the city of Pokrovsk. I'll remind you that several days ago the Russians entered the village of Mirolubovka, but after that we stopped receiving any updates regarding additional progress or regarding the current status on the ground. But today we start receiving videos how the Russians were bombing and basically pummeling the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine on the eastern flank. As for the Novopavlovka direction, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions once again in the direction of the settlement of Novoalexandrovka. Basically, according to Ukrainian sources, the Russians began their major offensive operation on the line between the settlements of Nadeevka and Novoalexandriivka on the 21st of April of 2025. And this is the video from the first day of offensive when the Russians were trying to improve their positions and when the Russians were trying to attack Ukrainian forces in the fields. And since the 21st of April, the Russians, as you can see, managed to improve their position significantly. For example, this is the situation by the 21st of April of 2025, and for example, this is the situation by the beginning of the 27th of April. The Russians managed to take under control this small river, and the Russians continue advancing. The Russian sources, by the way, also published this video where they show how they were attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine. So now we see that the Russians are trying to take the village of Novoalexandriivka and Spinsers from the south, and the Russians are trying to establish control over the villages of Uspenovka and Novoalexandriivka from the east. This is a very important village, and this village will allow the Russians control over this village, will allow the Russians to get as close as possible to the region of Dnipro. At the same time, the Russians continue their offensive operation on the settlement of Bogatyr. It's probably 10th day when the Russians are making another attempt to assault the village of Bogatyr from the southeast. As for now, another attempt from the Russian side was repelled, but despite the fact that the Russian attack was repelled, we got this geolocation where we can see how the Russians were attacking the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine from the south. In this video, we can see Russian motorcycles that entered this tree line, and then the Ukrainians began bombing positions of the Russian forces with cluster rounds. This episode took place exactly in this area, and this video confirms that the Russians managed to shorten the distance from the southern part, from the southern directions to the stronghold in the southwest of the settlement to less than 2 kilometers. So the Russians are getting closer and closer. Another week and the settlement of Bogatyr either would be captured by the Russians or the Russians would control more than 50% of this settlement. The Russians established complete control over the main supply lines that go in this direction with artillery strikes and FPV drone attacks. So the situation for the Ukrainians in this direction is is worsening. Now let's discuss the situation in the Zaporizhzhia direction. We have very important update. I'll remind you that in April the Russians attacked the city of Mala-Tokmachka. As a result of that attack, the Russians established complete control over the southeastern part of the settlement, but today we see that several mappers reported that Ukrainians managed to counterattack this territory and to restore control over these facilities. The Russians were forced to fall back further in the southeastern directions towards the, let's say, neighboring tree lines. So the situation here is very difficult. We see that Ukrainians are trying to stabilize the situation by introducing additional forces and reinforcements. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.